Hello everybody and welcome to Breakdown,
the podcast series that breaks down all the latest crime and punishment news, but it does so with a twist. So as you can see, Max is back with us. He's back in town today. Woo! So we have got a bit of a different type of podcast today, so we're going to talk this through. I think it's going to be interesting, excuse me, but I would say that because I've produced and prepared it alongside Max. So there are going to be different stages of the podcast, but we're going to talk a little bit about the theme of the podcast is going to be about stigma, the prison experience, identity, and relationships, so intimate relationships post-prison. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that stigma links to what we would call lived experience spaces. So people who have had criminal justice experience coming into criminological spaces, whether that be practice or literature. We're going to use two articles, one magazine article and another's a journal article, but we want to set the context. We're saying we don't want to highlight too much on the individuals. Those articles are just going to provocate us to be allowed to talk about something that me and Max have been talking about for a while. And then we're going to finish talking about positionality and particularly marginalised voices within lived experience and criminological spaces. So what I wanted to do first is introduce Dwayne Antojado. I hope I've got that right, Dwayne, if you do listen to this podcast. He did a recent magazine article where he talked about intimate relationships after the incarceration experience, and both Max and myself thought it would be a good place to start to kind of highlight this broader topic that we wanted to discuss. So you will see that the text is on the screen now, but I'll just quickly run through it, and then I'll first hand over to Max, if that's okay, Max, so we can start to kind of talk it through a little bit. So Dwayne states that the prison experience is a porous one. For those who have been previously incarcerated, the remnants of the past continue to linger beyond the walls, be it police check to gain employment, the stigma from people you come into contact with, or in brackets coming out to those you date, so intimate relationships. It's an inescapable reality that formerly incarcerated people endure, and we know that it's a big challenge to social reintegration. The emotion, self-doubt, anxiety and insecurity that can sometimes be debilitating, that you struggle to function and see things clearly, making you think it's okay to settle for what you think you deserve, even though deep down you are unhappy and dissatisfied. This challenge is nowhere more apparent than in relationships, and he means intimate relationships. So I'll jump to the back end of that article now, but before I do that, Max, when you hear that, what's the first thing that kind of jumps out to you in terms of the conversations that we've been having?
Well, I think it starts. I mean, talking about sort of the prison experience and the sort of stigma of DBS checks and maybe even to a point the sort of early post-prison time. I think I'm sort of I'm with him on that sort of how to navigate or experience what you think might be stigma. I think, but from that point onwards, I just don't recognise my experience in his experience. I mean, and that's fine. You know, we all come out. I mean, and this is the crux of it, right? We all come at this from different places. But yeah, I don't recognise, you know, the stuff about sort of being debilitated and having to feeling like I'm settling for worse, settling for less, and sort of coming out in relationships and things like this. Yeah, it's just not something that I recognise. I mean, that might be because. I mean, listen, if I'm honest, if about the sort of paths that I've taken, for a start anyway, I've never had to come out to anyone that I've been in prison because sort of everyone that I know mostly or have grown up around or, you know, in a relationship with now or whatever, that's just kind of like the norm. That's just kind of like the norm anyway, or at least it's not out of the ordinary. Do you know what I mean? And then also, you know, working, you know, I was in the addiction and recovery sector, and I'm in the criminal justice sector, and you know, if anything, my lived experience is a badge. You know what I mean? It's a capital. It's something that I wear with pride, and I'm not. It's not pride because of the things that have happened, but it's a benchmark of I've gone through this. This is where I've come from, and this is where I'm at now. You know, so I don't recognise my relationship with my past isn't one of shame and wanting to conceal and hide and worry about how to navigate it. It's something that I stand on. Do you know what I mean? I feel like I've got every right to stand on it because I'm proud of who I am, of who I am now, and that is a part of my journey. Do you understand what I mean?
No, I do, 100%. And so for me, so I talked to you. I've talked to my wife actually. She was like, I said, I'm going to do this podcast about this article that's come out, and she asked me the question. My wife, who I've been married to 10 years, she said, "Are you proud?" And I think she knew it was a rhetorical question, because I think she knew the answer to it. She was walking around the park, walking the dog yesterday, and she said, "Would you say you're proud of it?" And the funny thing is, I don't think the crime or the prison is pivotal point in my journey. So the things that I'm proud of is the fact that I got turfed out of school, I was in care, my mum was in care, I was addicted to heroin, that unfortunately led to crime. But the crime that led to prison, usually there were split-second decisions, or there was a bit of a kind of a journey towards it, but it wasn't consistent. So I don't think, am I proud of I think you just articulated it there. I'm not proud of my prison experience, and I'm not proud of the fact that I've been to prison, or certainly not proud of the reasons I went to prison, because that often included someone that was a victim of crime as well, in different contexts. What I'm proud of is the predisposition that I started from, and the position that I'm at now, working in higher education and having a 15-year career in youth justice. So just like you, I don't know where that shame and stigma comes from, but I think it might be different for different people, like you said. Like going to jail wasn't a surprise. It didn't come out the woods for me. Do you know what I mean? It was something that was, yes, it was difficult, but my trajectory kind of indicated that that's where I was going. So therefore, it's engraved so much in my identity that if I say to somebody who's not been in those social circles that I've been to prison, and they look down their nose, or they attach some kind of stigma towards me, then I think there's something wrong with them and not something wrong with me.
I think it's interesting. So I think the crux is about what position you come at it from, in terms of, like they say, like the label, offender label, So Goffman talks about stigma, Irving Goffman, a sociologist, as a spoiled. He says it's a spoiled identity, right? So it makes sense to me, and I'm not speaking directly to this article. And like Andy said, the reason that we're having this conversation is because these sort of conversations around sort of stigma and these labels and they're flying around, and we've been seeing them for a while, yeah. But I was just saying that, yeah. So spoiled identity. So it makes sense to me that if you were someone who was, a citizen working, a husband, a wife, if you were studying at university, if all these things were making up your identity, your trajectory, and then something bad happened, or something took you on a bit of a little wrong path, and you got convicted of a crime that took you to prison, which undoubtedly would be quite sort of traumatic if someone hasn't sort of been sort of leading up to that thing, and then they come out the other side. It makes sense to me that the idea of a spoiled identity, that feeling of stigma, which is a sort of version of shame, right? It makes sense to me that resonates with them, because that is their spoiled, that wasn't their identity, and then they go to prison, and then it's like, well, that's my identity's been sort of tarnished, spoiled by this sort of offender label. Now I want to move away from that. I want to forget about that. I can perceive that people are judging me as this thing, right? So okay, so that's one position. But the other position is this, yeah. If, like, exactly like you're saying, Andy, and most of it applies for me too. But if you start from a position of you was kicked out of school, you was addicted to drugs when you was young, you was getting locked up, you was in the back of police vans, you was getting from this big getting took on by police officers, in and out of prison, in and out of police cells, courts, magistrates, crown courts, yeah. You're not leaving you're not leaving when you're released from prison for the first, second, third, or fourth time. I don't think, or at least I wasn't. I'll speak about me. I wasn't leaving prison with a spoiled identity. I wasn't leaving it with some shame about what had happened to me that I wanted to conceal. This was it. This was my life. This was my life. This was the people that I knew. This was the places that I lived. This is what I'd been building up to. You know what I mean? This is it was. So here's the other thing, right? So then what counts? So then it could be a case of like counterbalancing. So I can't conceal, or at least this is how I see myself. Might not be the same. I feel like I can't conceal my past, yeah, because it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a silly mistake. You know what I mean? It was who I was. So I can't conceal it or disentangle myself from it or shun it or try and put it in a back step, because it's so fundamental to who I am and who I am now. And I'm a father, and I'm going on a little bit now. I'm a father, and I'm a university, doing a master's degree, and I'm working, and I'm this, and I'm that, and then whatever the case may be. I am proud of where I have been to where I am now.
Yeah, I mean, you have jumped a little bit into the next article, but that's fine because we'll kind of cross references. No, but in the as you can see here, the conclusion to Dwayne's article, and I think he cross references, or he conflates two things here, which I wanted to point out. So he says, as you can see there, as we continue to navigate the complexities of post-incarceration relationships, let us collectively strive to dismantle the societal stigmas that perpetuate the cycle of self-doubt and insecurity by fostering empathy, understanding, and providing avenues for support. We can create a society that truly believes in the transformative power of redemption and second chances. The prison experience should not be a lifelong sentence to emotional isolation. Instead, it should be an opportunity for growth, resilience, and forging connections that defy societal expectations. That makes complete sense, right? Where I think there's a conflation there is that he's talking about interpersonal and intimate relationships. So I've told you before, I remember years ago, not long I've got out of jail, I'm working though, and I took this girl out, this woman out, and she was a manager in a bank. I met her through my friend. She must have thought, oh, Andy's a bit of all right, so she sent him over to talk to me, and we went out on a date, right? But like on any date, like she wanted a serious relationship, I could tell. So she was prompting and probing about my past and all that kind of stuff. And so inevitably I had to say, yeah, I've been jailed, because going back to what you were saying, I can't really not talk about it, because it's been a part of my life since I was pretty much born. Crime, and then prison, school exclusion, drug addiction. So I told her, and she said to me, my parents wouldn't accept you, right? So, but as much as that didn't feel good at the time, I completely understand that, right? Because people should be allowed in their intimate relationships to have a preference of what they do and don't want to take home to their parents, right? So I think we can argue that there should be less stigma and we should be second chances and redemptions. Of course, I've spent about 20 years in my professional career arguing that, but I'm not sure we can go down a road of saying, well, we can dictate what people do and don't choose in their intimate relationships. So you could take it away from crime and talk about something else, like cheating, for example. If you went out on a date and said, I've cheated on every single partner that I've been in, but I feel like I deserve a second chance. If my daughter, who's 8, come home and said that she'd been out on a date with somebody and they said that to her, I would say, yeah, probably better off not bringing him back. So we can't dictate those things in those familiar relationships, because it's just preference. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think you can't. So I mean, there's two different ways, isn't it? That stigma can operate sort of structurally, and through sort of power differentiations. But yeah, like you said, if someone or one of their sort of no-nos is, or against one of their values, would be to be with someone who'd been in prison. I mean, here's the thing, right? Yeah, if that was me, and someone was saying, "Oh, listen, I can't get past this part about you," my response to that would be, "All right, so well, good, like, good riddance."
Because that's not your preference, right? That's not your preference.
Yeah, like what I mean, like it was never going to work anyway. Do you know what I mean? Because exactly what I was saying before, like if that to you is a deal breaker, then I'm pretty sure I've got a lot of other deal breakers too. Do you know what I mean? Because that sort of that part of me is intrinsic to who I am. So whatever, but again, people have preference.
But the other side to that is that, and we spoke about this before, when I've got out of custody previously, and I'm not going into middle class spaces, like I'm not, say she's middle class, I don't know. She was from spaces that I've been from, right? Going to prison, I wouldn't say has been a tick box for girls that I've been in relationships with, but I've walked into clubs before, right? And everybody's like, "Yo, he's out." So the fact that I've now stepped back into the social circles that I've grown up in, post being in prison, has not only not been a barrier to relationships, it's prompted conversations with many girls that operate in those spaces too. So again, going back to your point, some of this stuff must depend on what your pre-incarceration experience was, because you know, like you say, my pre-incarceration spaces is that being involved in crime and prison never stopped me having a relationship with any of the girls that were in the spaces that I were in. And post-incarceration, it would have never been a factor as to whether I would or would not go with somebody of the opposite sex in a relationship. So some of this must be wrapped around the types of people that you're trying to obtain relationships with post-prison.
Yeah, and like you said, like the world that you come from, it's just, you know what, it's just reminding me. It's quick because it's quite similar. But so when I went to rehab in 2019, that's where I got into recovery, blah blah blah. And I remember I was talking with a guy that I'd become friends with. So rehab is a real sort of cross mix of people, you know, from street using, class A users to, you know, cocaine users. So it's a real sort of mixing pot, right? Anyway, so I'm talking to this guy, and he's got his family coming, and he's saying, "Oh, it's good that they're coming. They're a bit sort of, it's all hush hush that he's gone to rehab. He was probably a bit younger than me at the time, but he was all a bit hush hush that he'd gone to rehab, you know. And they were upset that he had let himself get to this point that he was in rehab. It was a point of shame, right? For him and his family, there was a shame attached to him being in rehab. There's a stigma attached to it. And he was telling me this, and I'm thinking, I was thinking, like, listen, my mum's telling postman, you know what I mean? Like, she you know, she's buzzing about it. You know, I'm in rehab. This was the single biggest achievement of my life up to that point. That point, that was the best thing I'd ever done with my life. Yeah, I was actually in rehab trying to make some change. But from this guy who had a different life history than I had, it was a real low point in his life. So it makes sense that we were both experienced the same place from completely different angles. Do you understand what I mean? And I know I'm talking about rehab, but I think the same thing could be true of prison. And by the way, I'm not trying to say go to prison the best way I've done in my life. I'm just using it to highlight. I'm just using it to highlight the differences. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's life biographies, isn't it? It's like what stories we tell ourselves and what stories of the people that are closest to us tell us. Because like you, I won't say who, but a quite prominent family member smuggled drugs into prison when I was just a child. So it's the same. Just exactly the same for you. Going to prison was never a stigma, not in my family, not in my social relationships. It does lead us on to talking about the next article, which was from Damien Quinn and Katharina Swirak, who I've communicated with both of them. Damien came to a lived experience conference, and, you know, they did an article in the Irish Probation Journal, and it was called Translating Lived Experience Criminal Justice Experience into Policy Innovation, Countering the Stigma of Criminal Record through a Strengths-Based Disclosure Model. And one of the things, again, that jumped out, and actually if you read this journal article, he's someone that's come from very similar experiences and backgrounds to us. But he talks a little bit, and this is where you were touching on about that, the disentanglement stuff. So he talks about but far beyond the immediate experience of leaving prison, I left with a label to this day can be really difficult to disentangle myself from, something I share in common with many others. And he highlights kind of David Honeywell's work around his PhD stuff and his higher education research. Now, again, that interests me because there seems to be a kind of narrative within criminological literature that, again, you mentioned it, it doesn't resonate with me. It's almost like we've got to disentangle ourselves with these backgrounds. I just don't know where that comes from. And there seems to be a missing part of the narratives about what we're talking through here, about being proud of it. So there must be two things going on. Either one, look, I've worked in higher education for a couple of years. They love this term oppressed and oppressors, right, from postmodern literature. And that's rife in the culture. So to be accepted into these spaces, there must be parameters set. That's number one. Number two is that some people like you and me who would kind of dispute some of that stuff and be like, let's go back to Dwayne's. He talked about debilitating. So I had to look that up in the dictionary. I knew what it kind of meant, but I didn't know what the definition was. And it was about the definition in the Oxford Dictionary is it's a disease or a condition to make someone weak or infirm. I just don't, that narrative, that stuff that's coming out that's quite, I think, dominant in the literature, it don't resonate with what you've just said about being proud of your experiences. Not that we don't experience discrimination because of our lived experience of incarceration, because I would say we do. I have various times, but it doesn't make me a victim. I'm not a victim. I wouldn't even subscribe to being a victim when I was incarcerated or addicted to heroin, if I'm being totally honest. So there's got to be something going on, and I put it to you and ask you a question. Do you think it's one of those options, or do you think there's another explanation for it?
Explanation for what?
Like why that discourse of, not being stigmatized or not feeling like you need to describe yourself as a victim of wider social structures just because you've been in custody. That doesn't seem, maybe I've not read it, but maybe I've not come across it, but it doesn't seem to be in the literature or in the discourses. It tends to be the narrative of, because we've been to custody, that we're victims of this kind of wider social structure. When, by the way, if you look at my social media, kind of spaces and, the kind of spaces that I've gone in, there are just far too many of us in criminal justice spaces for that narrative to be true, in my opinion. So I'm asking you, do you agree with that first and foremost? And what do you think maybe might be an explanation for that?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think so. Basically, why is that sort of narrative so prominent within the sort of academic key spaces?
Yeah,
well, I think it's down to exclusivity, isn't it? So I think the academic spaces are only so in politics. I can't remember the right word for it, but they talk about an argument sometimes or a news story in politics that's very sort of incestuous. So it's very sort of about this front bencher said this about this, and I'm sure they say something like, oh, it's really it's a Westminster story or it's a SW1 story, and what it means that it really only matters for that very small insular amount. It's not a wider story. Yeah, I think the same can be about sort of debates around some of this stuff in academia, in the sense that it's very niche. So like we're in it, but like the people who populate academia and even in working lived experience in practice is still very tiny subsection, small section of the entire population of prison experienced or criminal justice experienced or people in recovery and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would hazard a guess that the vast majority of people that go back to the spaces that they've come from and don't start working, even take academia out of it, yeah. Even if you're working like how I've done it in practice, and then you start working in a drug service, and actually not everyone's lived experience, and you sort of exposed to a different kind of culture and this and that. And I think if you go back to where you come from and these ideas about navigating labels and all that sort of stuff. I just don't think it has any purchase. I think the reason it probably comes out in the academic side is because it's sort of like that sort of that mobility issue, that sort of like social mobility of moving into a new domain where you might feel them sort of things, and it's about who comes into those spaces in the first place.
Yeah, well, I think for me, it does make sense. Yeah, and I'm gonna pop up David Breakspear's LinkedIn post here where he says he's talking about going back into prisons. So he's saying you can take a man out of a prison, as shown yesterday by Ross Smith when I walked out of HMP Chelmsford, but you can't take the prison out of the man, as is evidenced once again this morning by where my head's at. As soon as I saw the gates of HMP Chelmsford, I felt like Martin McFly. Then he's put, being sent to prison was a punishment. Going back into prison is a privilege, right? So I'm going to say, I don't know one way. It might sound a bit harsh, this, right? But if you do not want to, be defined by your criminal past, don't come in to the criminal justice system or step into criminology literature and keep talking about your lived experience, because it sounds to me like you want in your cake and you want, what's the old saying? You want to eat your cake and have it too. Like if you step into these spaces, then inevitably, and you're going to be open about your lived experience, you can't then dictate how people do or don't respond to your experience. And by the way, most of this stuff, whether it's me, you, David, Anthony, we're actually contributing to criminology literature and then claiming to be oppressed and stigmatized. I think we need to stop talking about ourselves as
David's not though, is it? Because he's
David's not.
Yeah.
The point I'm making by introducing David's is that's the counter narrative. So it's not in the literature. It's on LinkedIn. But that point that David's making is an excellent one. Is that being sent to prison as a punishment, but coming back as a privilege. So if you want to come back after you've had these experiences and contribute, whether to criminology literature or to criminal justice practice, there has to be an element of let's talk it up. Let's be positive about it, rather than still claiming to be held or constrained by some wider structures. Because the very fact that we're even talking about it means that there's it's not that them things aren't true, but we're representing a whole group of people that are facing proper discrimination. Yeah. So if they've not come into the spaces that we're coming, where we're privileged now, I'm certainly privileged now. I would say I come from a certain background, but I live a middle class life. There's no good me talking about how oppressed and stigmatized and alienated I am, because it does my brother, who's heroin addicted and homeless, it does him no good. Because he's facing proper stuff. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think that's going back. The only thing I would say about Dwayne's going back to his beginning article, and for me, there's only one kind of key criticism there, because it's just his story. That's all. But at the beginning, he says, for those who have been previously incarcerated, the remnants of the past continue to linger beyond the prison walls, be it police check, and then he gives those three things: stigma or coming out. We need to probably stop talking about people who have been incarcerated as an homogenous group that have an homogenous experience, because this conversation has ironed that out. Just because we've been to prison and have a common experience doesn't mean we've got a common biography or a common life experience. So we probably need to step a little bit away from that and realise that we are all individuals within that experience.
Yeah. And just to sort of tag on to that as well. And it's also not to say that there's anything wrong with if that is your experience coming out and that you do feel that weight and that burden and that sort of, or maybe you don't even feel that shame, but you feel that people see that shame. But I would sort of say that sometimes, like it's in the eyes of the beholder kind of thing as well at the same time. Not saying it doesn't exist. It's like anything. If you're looking for something, you'll find it. But but what I'm saying is that it's not. We're not saying that that's not the right narrative. We're just saying that there's this other narrative that you don't really hear as much. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's because it's usually the people who have got these narratives that aren't around as much. But anyway, like Andy said, there's far too many of us here to be complaining that we're not here. But go on, Andy. I was lost what I was.
No. What I was going to say is just to kind of build on that point is that I work in higher education. I don't always feel I was excluded from the biggest barrier I believe I experienced in higher education is that I was excluded from school. So I haven't got that foundational kind of academic learning. I'm trying to catch up, and I think I've done a pretty good job at it. But it's not nobody alienates me because I've been to custody. It's not even I don't think it's even something that people even think about. But for my internal stigma, it's that lack of educational journey into higher education. So we've got to sometimes be careful about what we're actually feeling alienated because of. Because if you think about it, you've got black academics, you've got working class academics, you've got loads of groups that don't particularly that are formulated groups because they don't particularly feel like they fit into that kind of elitist educational environment. So sometimes I guess we've got to be careful about what is it that's, again, your point, what is it that we're feeling stigmatized about? Is it class? Is it academic attainment? Is it the fact that we've been incarcerated? And that will be different for different people, right? Because like you said, if you go through school, do well, maybe get a degree, go to prison, come out and go back into university, that might be the defining factor that makes you feel alienated. But for me, I wouldn't even be able to work out why I don't feel like I fit in higher education sometimes. So do you know what? I don't bother. I just get on with it.
Yeah. I think because I agree with that. I do feel. I mean, it's getting less so now, but talk about fish out of water in higher education. You know what I mean? I've never felt more like I had about 10 signs pointing at me. But again, I never sort of. It would be easy to go to like the prison experience, but I think it was more. Well, the most starkest thing that I could see was about class. Do you know what I mean?
And I would agree with that. That's my fundamental thing. I think class and being from a subculture and coming into higher education is the biggest reason why I certainly feel like sometimes, not always, but sometimes like I don't quite fit. But we've got to appreciate that. Like I say, it's different for different people because we're not an homogenous group, are we? Yeah. Okay, this has gone along. This has been great conversation, hasn't it, Max? But it's gone quite a bit longer than we anticipated. But that's because of the content, I think, of the discussion. So yeah, I just wanted to say to everybody, kind of thanks for joining me and Max on the podcast, and we might have a little surprise for you next time, hopefully, but we're not quite sure yet, so I'm not going to tell you what that might be. But just like we always say, if you could like the video and you could subscribe with the channel so that you can receive content when we release it, that would be great. So bye for now.